Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt, joined by United States Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas. Senator, welcome. Earlier today, I played your remarks on the floor of the Senate yesterday about Israel and the AP. I don't imagine the media much like that, but I compliment you on calling these issues out.
Well, I'm glad your listeners got to hear it this morning, Hugh. The AP has some uncomfortable questions they need to answer. Everyone probably knows by now that Israel struck a building in Gaza that Hamas intelligence was using to target Israeli citizens. That building also happened to house the AP and other news media. Israel, as is its practice, gave the innocent civilians in the building advance warning so they could evacuate, which of course means that Hamas gets advance warning and terrorists regrettably get away. But that's because Israel respects human life, unlike Hamas. The AP and other reporters got up in high moral dudgeon about this fact. But one has to ask, did the AP not know who their neighbors were? I mean, there's evidence out there, Hugh, from videos to former AP reporters saying that they've known for years they were sharing office buildings with Hamas, basically allowing themselves to be used as human shields, all the while suppressing what Hamas was doing in that building, firing rockets away or trying to terrorize reporters. So I think it's incumbent upon the AP leadership to explain exactly how long they have known that they were sharing an office with a U.S.-designated terrorist organization.
Now, you also posed on Twitter a very penetrating question. Would AP share a building with al-Qaeda? And I'd like you to make the point. Al-Qaeda and Hamas are, in the eyes of the United States government, the same thing, designated terrorist organizations.
Yeah, there is no difference between al-Qaeda and Hamas to radical Sunni Islamic terrorist organizations. They are both designated by the United States as terrorist organizations. Would the AP or would any of their defenders in this controversy be willing to share office space with al-Qaeda? If they learned that al-Qaeda was upstairs or down the hall, would they stay in that office space? Would they go to the authorities and report on what they had discovered? I think these are some of the uncomfortable questions that the AP leadership needs to answer, Hugh.
Now, I also talked with Matt Continetti of AEI and Fred Barnes of the Washington Examiner this morning about the media's coverage of the Israeli self-defense underway and still underway. Regrettably, when I was talking with Dr. Oren, 2 more Israeli citizens were killed this morning, 2 more seriously injured in missile attacks. But it does seem to me that the American media has gone significantly anti-Israel, far more than it's ever been before. Do you see that, Senator Cotton?
Unfortunately, Hugh, the American media, of course, usually reflects the opinion of the elite left in this country. And the left in this country has become increasingly anti-Israel in recent years. You see that from elected Democrats who are calling Israel an apartheid state and demanding that we cut off our support to Israel, or that Israel's leaders be charged for war crimes. Those opinions marinated in campus seminar rooms and marches out in our streets are reflected by their peers and former classmates and their friends in the American media. And that's why you get news media asking, how could this happen? Why did this war start now? Well, it started because Hamas started firing hundreds of rockets and missiles into heavily populated cities in Israel. It's pretty simple. And it will end when Hamas's war machine is defeated.
Matt Continetti made an interesting point, Senator, which I had not heard made before, which is this is also very much about an internal Palestinian and Arab power struggle about who is going to lead the Palestinian struggle, that Hamas wishes to use this attack as an effort to derail the coalition government that appeared to include Ra'am, an Islamist party in Israel that was on the verge of taking power from Netanyahu, and to further discredit the Palestinian Authority. Have you heard that theory? Do you put much credit to it?
Yeah, so that's possible, Hugh. It's also possible that it's related to internal Palestinian politics with the prospect of an election coming up this year. As the saying goes, Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the PA, is now in the, 16th year of his 4-year term from the last time they had an election. But irrespective of those considerations, whether there's some effort by Hamas to interfere in Israeli politics or to redirect Palestinian politics, of course, there is never a justification for the use of terror to achieve political ends, much less the use of terror in the form of thousands and rockets and missiles being fired indiscriminately at innocent civilians.
Now, Senator, you're one of the very few members of Congress I can ask this of. Since you led platoons in Iraq during the height of the surge, to what extent can militaries guard against collateral damage? And I think that's a terrible term, against civilians dying. And I know that the American military and the Israeli military take extraordinary measures to do just that. But how much does the United States and do you think Israel put into that effort?
We're the two of the most disciplined and moral militaries in the world. If anything, though, the Israeli Defense Forces go the extra mile to ensure that there is as little civilian casualties on the battlefield as possible. The example I gave you to start is a good one. They could have just pancaked that building that Hamas was using for intelligence purposes, irrespective of civilians inside of it. I mean, it's a legitimate military target, and the people responsible for those civilian casualties would have been Hamas. But they didn't do that. They called in advance. They told the innocent civilians, clear out now. And what did that mean? It meant all those Hamas intelligence personnel were able to escape alive, and today they're once again targeting Jews for death inside of Israel. Now,
go ahead.
Israel does that because they respect and esteem human life, unlike Hamas.
And so in minimizing civilian casualties, they do pay a cost because those terrorists live to fight another day. The second story this week is that some in the media were upset that Israel may have misled the media as to a ground invasion. Now, I was actually paying very close attention to the statements that came out of Israel, and they said attacking from the ground, which is so different from a ground invasion. My antenna were up that something odd was going on. It was, in fact, an effort to trick Hamas into going into the tunnels or coming out of the tunnels or both, depending on which units were involved. Did you see that outrage, and what did you make of it?
Well, Hugh, you're not going to get me to cry crocodile tears if a bunch of Hamas terrorists were duped by military subterfuge, deception, or camouflage, which is as old as warfare itself. You're right, though, that the Israeli military, to my knowledge, was very precise in the terminology it used. It can't be held responsible if ill-informed Western reporters didn't read carefully enough.
Now, a couple of last questions about the Israeli military. In the 7 years since 2014, it appears that they have developed a new generation of weapons which can penetrate into the so-called metro. Is that your understanding without giving away classified sources? Are they better at this now, blowing up tunnels, than they were in 2014?
Hugh, when you phrase it that way, yes. Of course, after 7 years of recognizing the threat that these Hamas terror tunnels pose, Israel has invested significantly in the ability to destroy those tunnels.
Do we have that ability in the United States, the same kind of technology?
Well, it doesn't pose the same threat to us, Hugh, that it does to Israel because of our geographic position. But let me simply say that the United States and Israel have a very close military working relationship, something that I've worked to advance in my time in the Armed Services Committee, and we share a lot of technology.
Now, let me close by asking you to contrast and compare. Senator Bernie Sanders and others in the Democratic Party have been completely outraged with Israel, and yet our Arab allies like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and others, including Saudi Arabia, have been very muted. In fact, I don't think they've condemned Israel at all compared to Hamas. I think they're more worried about Hamas. So is it unusual to see Bernie Sanders more critical than Arab allies of the actions of Israel?
Regrettably, that's become increasingly normal, Hugh. You're right that a lot of these Arab nations have their own threats from radical Islamic extremist groups like Hamas and al-Qaeda. Also, let's not forget who Hamas's main patron is, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is the chief threat also to countries like Saudi Arabia and to the United Arab Emirates. So Iran is also up to its usual tricks because the Biden administration in Vienna has been basically begging the Ayatollahs to come back into the Iran nuclear deal, which means the lifting of sanctions and hundreds of billions of dollars pouring to Tehran, which will immediately go back to Hamas and to Hezbollah in the forms of rockets and missiles aimed at Israeli citizens.
You're right. On that note, Senator Tom Cotton, thank you for joining me this morning. Follow him on Twitter at SenTomCotton. SenTomCotton.